Hello, everyone. My name is Hamilton. Today, I'll be starting the class of more philosophy. Um, so we're just going to wait a minute here to see if anybody else is joining us. If not, we'll just get started right away.
You're muted.
Hello. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. So, can you see my screen as of now?
No.
Okay. Hello. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So um, hello, everyone. I have shared the material on Google Classroom. So if we can just use that, because I think I'm having a little bit of difficulty presenting. While I'm presenting, they don't really let me speak. So for some reason, that did not work. So do you guys mind just going over to Google Classroom and just going into the second slide? Just let me know if you guys have access to the material in the chat. And I have also shared that link in our Zoom chat. So if you guys can just open that and we'll just get started right away. All right, so I'll get started. So for anyone who's I just shared the document again in the chat. So if you can just open the Google slide to the second slide, we'll just get started right there. So today we're going to talk about Jeremy Bentham, utilitarianism. The idea of the greater number is the greatest good. And as you can see on the second slide, there's a portrait of Bentham. And on the right side is basically basically another hymn. That was pretty much in the University College of London. And you can see actually his head was placed under his body, his actual head. The reason for that is really because the embalming for his body went rather badly. And basically they left his head under the chair for that reason. So who is Bentham? Bentham really is, I would think that he has three titles. One of them is that he's a founder of utilitarianism, and also he's a theoretical jurist, uh, meaning that Bentham really is exploring law in a theoretical sense, and he's also an economist in some sense. So basically, this is the philosophical foundation of his idea. So nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. So the idea really is that we have two masters, basically pain and pleasure. And the idea is really that we like pain and we do not like pain, we like pleasure. So in that sense, we have to think about the principle of utility. We're currently on slide 4. So really, we're thinking about the utility of that, utility as our principle. What that basically means is that we're going to maximize our pleasure over pain. So this is basically the philosophical foundation that Bentham has and the justification for what utilitarianism is. And then we'll move on to the next slide, slide 5. So basically what Bentham is suggesting is really two things. One thing is that the motives of action are really grounded in the apprehension of pain. So again, really, we dislike pain. we do like pleasure. So that is the fundamental basis of how we act and how we choose to act. And the other one is really thinking about pleasure as the only good. Basically, the degree of pleasure is what um, determine whether or not actions are right or wrong. So if you think about it in this sense, is really, I'll use another word, really happiness. In this case, pleasure or happiness is the most important thing in evaluating what morality should be. So that is Bentham's idea. So I would move on further into some of the things he suggested as a philosopher. Um, have I lost anybody at this point? Do we all kind of get what Bentham's idea really is? Um,
Can you like explain what utilitarianism is again?
okay, utilitarianism is basically we like pleasure over pain, right? So what we do in utilitarianism is we use utility. Basically, we maximize pleasure over pain because we, as human, tend to dislike pain, and we do like pleasure. So we maximize pleasure and we minimize pain. Well, so in that case, that would be the fundamental idea of utilitarianism.
Okay, thank you.
It's not necessarily to only go to have. We'll delve a bit more into that, and I'll be asking some questions on the way, so you guys can just jump right in, because philosophies require deliberation and discussion. So if I don't ask any questions, it wouldn't make much sense. So can we move on to slide 6? So on slide 6, Bentham's approach really is he figured out a way to calculate these things. He titled this really philosophic calculus, basically means the calculus of happiness. So the 4 factors are really the most important thing in considering what happiness is. One is intensity, one is the duration, and one is the certainty or uncertainty, and the other one is the remoteness of pleasure. So eventually what he did is that if the people can take into account of these factors and use it as a model, as a basis for whether or not they should do anything, this would be the way. He did say that it was not the perfect way. As you can see, it's really vague. Basically, it's very difficult to determine just from this theoretical sense what pleasure and pain should be, or how that balance could be determined using this calculus. But Bentham did mention that he believed that if you use it in the right way, eventually it would be close, at least closer to utilitarian thinking. Have I lost anybody at this point? Does that make sense? So we have another person joining us. So the person who just joined, you can just go into the Google Docs, the Google slide, and we can go over slide. If you can hear me, we're going over slide 6 right now. Basically, what Bentham's idea is about. I'll just move on because everybody's been listening to this for a while. So basically, the calculus is founded on the principle of utilitarian logic. So the idea really is that these 4 factors we take into consideration and we do a calculation on whether or not that this is benefiting you or benefiting society as a whole. So essentially, in utilitarian thinking, it's really the notion of maximizing everything for the society. So in that sense, it's not only pursuing pleasure, it's really about how do we bring pleasure, utility into society in that sense. So we'll just move on to slide 7. So what Bentham had later on suggested, his theory was basically another method that he was talking about on slide 7 was disappointment prevention method. So what this actually means is that unhappiness of you losing something, an individual, anyone who lost anything, will be higher than the happiness who bought to an individual who gained from that lost, right? So if just give you an example, if I steal something from you and we happen to be in the same economic status, my unhappiness will be higher if my objects got stolen by another person who was in my social economic caste. Basically, the reduction of utility to one individual caused by theft will have a greater bearing on that person's happiness. So in that sense, this is the reason why protection of property would be very important. This is the reason why we should not have stealing using this logic. Does that make sense, the logic? So the logic essentially, I would think, in this case, really begins to brought up more of a thinking about fundamentally what the common good would be, right? Essentially, Bentham's method was to maximize utility for society, utility for the country, in his mind. So this is the reason why protection of property would be important. But there would be a different condition, right? So if the economic status of a person is very different, right? So if we say that I happen to be a very wealthy person, and the person who stole from me is very desperate, he do not have much of any money. In that case, if he stole from me, the person would gain much more happiness, much more pleasure because he needed the money more than I do. I would not lose that much happiness since I am already wealthy. So in that case, the disappointment prevention method wouldn't work. But if you think about this idea in a general context, it does make some sense. It does make a strong philosophical point as to why we should protect property. And then we can move on to slide 8. Are we clear on what the idea here is and what the logic is? Okay, so someone just asked me a question. So the question is that I did not say why stealing shouldn't be allowed. So I guess you're approaching it from a moral sense, right? Stealing should not be allowed because stealing from somebody else is wrong, right? So Bentham, again, we talked about this at the beginning, is basically that this is a philosophy about really about happiness. Fundamentally, how do we maximize it, right? So for Bentham, it's not a question of morality. The only idea to determine is whether or not that this thing will bring pleasure to most people. So in the case that I've talked about, specifically that logic, it would be wrong, particularly to steal, because it would not maximize utility in this society. The reason being is because if we all happen to be in similar cases, similar economic sense, then if you do steal from somebody else, it would make them unhappy. So then there will be less of a balance in that case. So Skylar, you have a question, right? Well, the law can't really make exception, otherwise it would take too much time in a trial. Can you specify that? You can just unmute yourself and specify what do you actually mean by that.
Like it gets unclear what the person actually did.
What do you mean by too much time on a trial?
Well, I mean, like, basically, like, the court is going to go through, like, this big manual of the law and, like, seeing this clause and this clause and this clause and seeing, like, and then, like, maybe we'll even find a contradiction somewhere.
What do you mean by the law in this case?
Basically, in the legal sense.
So let me try to get this clearly. Are you saying that if we use Bentham's approach in law, it will create a lot of difficulties in the legal
Yeah,
system?
that's what I'm trying to say.
Okay. So I think here we have two objections to it, right? Bentham is not perfect by any means, right? So let's think about it in this way. What Bentham's approach is really, generally speaking, benefiting the majority, right? So if we can make the majority happy and also the minority happy in some cases, utility would be preferred, right? So if you talk about specifically law, Bentham's approach would be, depending on what circumstance it is, right? So if we say, in a philosophical sense, we talk about law, let's just say crime and punishment, right? We can talk about that in this sense, right? So what exactly is the answer here, right? On death penalty. So if we can move on to slide 10, we can go over that example. So Skylar mentioned this really interesting idea really about a time on a trial, right? How specifically can we get in trial? I don't think it's necessarily about how difficult the clauses are, because fundamentally clauses are difficult. But the idea here is really that whether or not that we're benefiting the most from these laws. It's Bentham's thinking, right? So if we talk about specifically death penalty, what we're doing is basically a cost-benefit analysis. So in the past, prisoners, they used to be people who will probably engage in hard labor, right? So prisoners will do a lot of hard labor and they will probably benefit society economically in that sense, right? So in that case, right, if you think about the law, whether or not we should abolish death penalty, and what Bentham would say is yes, we should abolish death penalty, because if we can keep these people doing hard labor, they would create more happiness for society, right? There will be more utility at the end of it. It doesn't really matter what the crime is in this case, right? So this is a different sense and a different view of justice. I understand why Mehdi is essentially saying that making exception in a moral sense, right? But this is Bentham's logic. So let's try to think through it in his logic, right? How do we benefit society? How do you benefit it? No matter what, essentially he said is really the utility or the happiness is the most important thing. So that is the only evaluative measure of moral. So it's nothing else. So in this case, if we say the death penalty, if we can benefit from it, from these hard labor, it would be just simply wrong to abolish. It will be great to abolish that penalty because of that reason. But again, I think Bentham later on suggested that if we move on to the example of treason, basically Bentham said was that as long as the person who treason lives, there will be a great deal of unhappiness of the country. that would outweigh the benefit of keeping him alive. Does that actually make sense? What I'm actually trying to get through is really, how do we think about it in a utilitarian sense? So does that make any sense? I think Skylar asked a really good question here, right? So specifically, we can talk a bit more about these things, but the idea of penalty is really not necessarily about how these benefit. It's not, as we see it traditional sense of moral, right? Because in moral, we would think stealing is wrong, and killing an individual is very wrong. But if we apply the utilitarian logic, right, there will be a different answer probably to that moral question that we were thinking of. It's a different way of thinking about things. So in this case, what we're seeing is a consequentialist argument. Basically, the consequence of one act is the most important thing. It does not really matter what the intention was. As long as the result is what we want, then it's acceptable. So same case with death penalty. We abolish it because we would get more labor out of it. We would get something more out of it. We would get much more economic benefit out of it. That outweighs killing them directly. Of course, people would argue also in a utilitarian sense that that would not be justified because there will be so much anger and so much pain on the other side of the person who is being murdered, who were wronged. But there must be a balance between the two. So Bentham's analysis eventually would say that abolishing death penalty is necessary because of the economic benefit, I would think. Does that make sense? What I'm trying to say is that utilitarian is not necessarily an idea where everybody agrees with everybody, right? So there could be different interpretation of utilitarianism, right? Specifically, onto whether or not there will be higher pleasure and lower pleasure on things, right? What is the definition of pleasure? And how do we make sure that there is a balance? There is basically an outweigh there, right? What's the analysis? And how do we conduct this analysis, right? These are the questions, if you're a utilitarian, you will be asking. Basically, what is our analysis? And how do we breach from these perspectives? So being utilitarian does not necessarily make you abolish death penalty by any sense, but in the case of Jerry Bentham, according to what he considered, death penalty is necessary. Death penalty is necessarily futile, and that it should be abolished in this case. Am I losing anybody at this point? Is there any more question that we want to ask? Okay, I take it that there's no more question. So can we move on to slide 8? So slide 8 is essentially how do we apply utilitarianism into economy? So essentially what Bentham said in his own word is the greater is the sum of social happiness, and especially of that happiness which depends upon the laws. So we have 4 priorities in Bentham's mind. The first is security. The second one is subsistence. And the third one is abundance. And the fourth one is equality. So basically, in a country, how you determine whether or not these things should be done is really according to these 4 factors, right? So the first factor is security. So that is the most important thing. So even though there will be a dire circumstance in which you won't be able to, say, redistribute wealth to people who need it the most, he would not agree to it unless there's a security basically security is in the process not sacrificed. So you have to provide security, subsistence, abundance, and equality before anything else happens. So security ranks before equality. So providing equality is not as important in this case. And the other thing I want to go a bit more deeper on is really about free market economy, basically the laissez-faire economy. What basically Bentham really said about this is really that we should have a free market. And the reason being is that a free market is generally producing the best result according to his personal experience with economy. So again, this is really about the consequence of really what economy should be. So in this case, what's the priority of economy? What would you guys think is the priority for economy in a nation? Let's think of it in a larger sense. What's the point of economy in a country? You guys can put it into chat. Skylar said U.S. economy. What do you mean by that?
Well, the U.S. economy affects everyone else's economy.
No, I meant just economy in a country, right? What's the most important point of economy in a country, right?
It's so you could buy stuff.
Right, so you can buy stuff, right? So basically the idea of national prosperity, right? So economy is basically what you're thinking about is really how important is this country, you know, economy-wise. If it's strong, then of course it will provide the country with better resources, and essentially better resources that would make sure that the people in this country will be happier, right? So that is the point of economy. So what Bentham would say is really, in this case, the reason why we should have a free market is that free market is generally the stronger kind of market rather than the ones being curtailed by monopolies and so on and so forth. So that would be his view. Of course, you can debate on whether or not that remains to be true today. The reason why I think that it could still be debated is whether or not regulation are important in the economy. Of course, I think most of us would agree that it is on a certain level important, right? Because eventually, even in a free economy, you would see a great deal of dominance in some company that tend to be trying to overtake their own industry, right? So that would be a case of monopoly. So that is certainly something I think we could think of as to why this is fundamentally a different way of thinking. So we can move on to the basically slide 9. So really, there is application of utilitarianism in legal thinking. So what that legal thinking is essentially about what he think is the most important thing in a political sense. How do we apply these methods, right? Because as Skylar said, it's quite difficult to think about statute that way. So virtual universal suffrage and parliaments and also secret ballots and transparency are the most important thing that he think is for any country, right? So I'll give you an example of why these things he believe is most important, and how does that come to that? For example, he believed there should be an unconstrained public debate. So that would fall into the idea of freedom of speech. the freedom of speech is most important because public opinion tribunal, as he called it, would resonate, would hold the public official accountable. So Bentham's reasoning is because, again, if we have this, then logically we would have, generally speaking, a result that would benefit the country, right? So the rest is really, there are 5 factors, 6 factors that he thinks are the most important. But I would like to say this beforehand. It's really, if we think about Bentham, it's not really about what specifically the ideas are, but how the ideas come about, right? How do you think like Bentham? Or how do you think like a utilitarian? I think that is the most important thing. It's not necessarily to debate these issues in specifics, right? I would think that Bentham's method, I think the question here that we're having is really that we object to some of Bentham's reasoning, right? His logical reasoning, because we object to the lack of morality behind it, right? So can anybody else talk a little bit more about why we should oppose to Bentham on that method, on that idea? Why that we should oppose utilitarian on certain level, or what's the kind of the risk that utilitarianism bring? You can just unmute yourself if you want to talk about anything. If not, I'll just continue and give an example about how that would be a case. I'll just give an example of why utilitarianism is foreign to what we generally think. So what I'd like to say is really on this case, specifically, if we go back to the idea of stealing, I would just like to ask you a question. Why is stealing wrong? Can anybody answer that question for me? Why would stealing be wrong?
Because it's taking other people's property.
Because basically it decreases the person's happiness more than it increases your happiness.
Okay, so we have 2 objections here. One is on the utilitarian side of